It was just after sunrise when Paul slipped on his old hiking boots, filled his travel mug with black coffee, and called out to his dog. "Come on, Max. Let's get some fresh air." The big German shepherd trotted over, leash in his mouth, tail wagging like he already knew where they were going. For the past 4 years, ever since Paul had retired from the fire department, this walk had become their daily ritual. Same trail, same time, same rhythm. And Max never broke routine. They set off down the wooded path behind Paul's house, the one that curled through a stretch of thick pines and ended in a quiet clearing. Birds chirped softly overhead. The air smelled like wet leaves and earth. Paul took a long sip from his mug and smiled. Peaceful mornings like these reminded him why he'd left the chaos of the city behind. But 10 minutes in, something changed. Max suddenly froze in his tracks. His ears stood up, nose twitching. Paul looked down, puzzled. "What is it, boy?" he asked. Max let out a low growl, then without warning, bolted off the trail and into the trees. "Max," Paul shouted, stumbling forward. "Get back here." But the dog was gone, weaving through the underbrush, barking wildly. Paul broke into a jog, heart pounding, not from exertion, but from something else. Instinct. Max never acted like this. Branches slapped at Paul's arms and legs as he pushed through the woods, trying to follow the sound of barking. It grew louder, more urgent, echoing off the trees. Then he smelled it, something sharp and sour. Not smoke from a campfire. Something worse. He reached a small clearing and stopped cold. There, at the bottom of a shallow ditch, was an old silver sedan, its front end crumpled against a tree. Smoke curled from beneath the hood. One of the tires had burst. The front bumper was bent in like an accordion. It looked like the car had flown off the road and landed there sometime during the night. But Max wasn't barking at the front of the car. He was at the rear passenger side, claws scraping at the door, barking like he was trying to wake the whole forest. Paul's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a wreck. Something, or someone, was still inside. He tossed his coffee, jumped down into the ditch, and ran toward the car, unaware that he was about to become part of a story no one would believe. Paul slid down the side of the ditch, dirt crumbling beneath his boots as he rushed toward the crashed car. Max was still barking nonstop, now throwing his weight against the rear door like he was trying to knock it open. Paul's firefighter instincts kicked in as he scanned the vehicle. The smoke wasn't thick yet, but it was coming fast from under the hood, too fast to ignore. He reached the back window and wiped away a layer of soot with his sleeve. At first, he saw nothing, just empty seats, broken glass, and the shredded remains of what looked like a child's backpack. But then he leaned closer and spotted something that made his blood run cold. A little girl. She was curled up on the floor of the back seat, barely visible between the shadows and smoke. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. Her mouth moved, but the sound was lost under Max's barking and the distant crackle of flames. Paul shouted, "It's okay. I see you." But she didn't respond. She looked frozen, not from the cold, but from terror. He pulled on the back door handle. It wouldn't budge. Locked. He ran to the other side, tried again. Nothing. The frame had crumpled slightly in the crash, sealing the doors tight. Paul cupped his hands against the glass. "Hang on, sweetheart. I'm gonna get you out." The girl shook her head and reached down toward her ankle, then held something up. Paul squinted. A chain. His stomach twisted. Someone had locked her in. Paul turned back to Max, who was now pacing anxiously beside the car. "Good boy," he said, rubbing the dog's head with trembling hands. "You found her. You really found her." Then a loud pop snapped Paul's attention back to the engine. Flames were now licking up from the front grille, hungrily consuming dried leaves that had gathered under the hood. The heat was rising. Time was running out. Paul dashed back to the ditch's edge, grabbed a heavy rock, and returned to the window. With one swing, the glass shattered. The girl flinched but didn't scream. Paul cleared the jagged edges with his coat sleeve, careful not to cut himself, and reached in. "I've got you," he said, trying to undo the chain. It was tight, too tight. The fire crept closer, the smoke thickening. Max barked louder than ever, circling behind Paul, and then he did something unexpected. He ran. Max's sudden dash took Paul completely by surprise. The dog ran circles around the ditch, growling and barking with urgency, then bolted into the woods, disappearing between the trees. "Max," Paul yelled, feeling the panic rising in his chest. What was the dog doing? Paul quickly turned back to the car, determined to finish what he started. His hands shook as he worked at the chain, still binding the girl's ankle to the seat. The fire was now inching up the front of the car, licking the edges of the windshield. The girl was crying. Her hands were pressed against her face as if she were trying to block out the horror unfolding around her. Paul's heart broke for her, but there was no time for comforting words. He had to get her out. He pulled harder at the chain, but it was locked tight. Every second was a threat, the rising heat from the fire now making him sweat. Desperation clawed at him. "I'm so close, sweetheart. Just hang on." The girl's eyes darted around the car, and then, as if by instinct, she reached down and grabbed a metal rod lying across the seat. She tried to pry it between the chain and the seat, her tiny hands shaking. But she was too small, too weak, and the chain was too thick. Tears streamed down her face. And then, through the thickening smoke, Paul heard it. A faint whimper, almost inaudible, but enough to make him stop. It wasn't the girl. It was Max. Paul's breath caught in his throat as he heard the sound again. Closer this time. It wasn't just a bark. It was a whine, a call for help. It came from deeper in the woods. Without thinking, Paul dashed away from the car, heading toward the sound. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but when he reached the edge of the trees, he froze. There, tangled in a mess of thorns and fallen branches, was Max. But Max wasn't alone. The dog had found something, a key. Max barked frantically, his tail wagging so hard it thudded against the ground. Paul knelt down and pulled the key from the dirt, disbelief flooding his chest. How had the dog known? How had he found it? Paul didn't waste another second. He raced back to the car, the key in hand, praying it was the one thing that could set the girl free. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted back to the burning car, Max's key clutched tightly in his hand. The flames had spread faster than he'd expected. The entire front of the car was now engulfed, crackling and spitting out sparks. But he wasn't about to let it stop him. Not now. Max was right there, barking urgently and pacing in circles, his eyes wide and focused. The dog seemed to understand exactly what Paul needed. Paul quickly reached the car and shoved his way through the shattered window, ignoring the stinging heat. He could feel the fire's hot breath on his neck as it spread closer to the car's interior. The girl was still there, her face streaked with tears. She looked up at Paul, her eyes wide with fear. She must have been terrified, trapped in the growing smoke, knowing she couldn't escape on her own. Paul held out the key, his hands shaking, sweat dripping from his forehead. "It's gonna be okay," he said, trying to reassure her, though his voice was tight with panic. "I've got the key. I can get you out." He quickly slid the key into the lock, but the heat was overwhelming. Sweat dripped into his eyes and his vision blurred. The lock clicked, but it was too hot for him to stay inside any longer. With a grunt of effort, Paul yanked the chain free and pulled the girl toward him, lifting her out of the back seat and onto the ground. The girl screamed, but it wasn't out of fear. It was a cry of relief. Paul half crawled, half dragged her out of the car and toward the edge of the ditch, where Max was waiting, his tail wagging furiously. The dog had never left their side, his eyes trained on Paul, making sure they were safe. But they weren't safe yet. The flames were licking the car now, too close for comfort, and the smoke was thickening with every passing second. Paul knew they needed to get out of there, fast. Max barked again, this time in a tone that seemed to demand action. Paul looked at him and realized what the dog was doing. Max was leading them. The dog darted ahead, pausing every few steps to check that Paul and the girl were following. "Good boy, Max," Paul whispered, his voice hoarse. "You saved us." With the dog guiding them, Paul ran as fast as he could, clutching the girl in his arms. They reached the tree line just as the car's windows exploded from the heat. The fire was fully ablaze now, but they were out of danger. They were alive. The smoke from the car fire billowed into the sky, thick and dark, as Paul and the girl stumbled into the safety of the trees. Max trotted beside them, his alert eyes scanning their surroundings as if ensuring they were out of harm's way. The fire's crackle and the distant sounds of sirens filled the air, but for the moment, they were safe. Paul's heart was still racing, and the girl clung to him, trembling, her small hands tightly gripping his jacket. Max, however, was calm, almost too calm. The dog had led them away from the burning wreckage and now stopped by a pile of fallen branches and leaves. He sat down, staring at Paul, tail wagging steadily. Paul paused, looking at Max. The dog had always been loyal, but this was something different. It was as if Max knew something Paul didn't. "What's wrong, boy?" Paul asked softly, crouching down next to Max. The dog's eyes were fixed on a spot in the dirt. Paul followed his gaze and, to his shock, saw Max's paw digging at the ground, moving dirt and leaves with urgency. "Max," Paul muttered, confusion lacing his voice. But there was no mistaking it. Max had found something. He kept digging, and soon enough, Paul could see the edge of a small metallic object buried beneath the soil. The earth was still warm from the fire, but Paul carefully pried the key free. It was old, rusty, and covered in mud, but there was no mistaking it. The key was real. Paul stared at it, heart pounding once again. How had Max known? How had the dog managed to find the key in the middle of nowhere, right when they needed it most? The girl, still shaking, took a tentative step toward Paul. She hadn't spoken a word since he pulled her out of the car, but now her eyes were locked on the key in his hand. She took a slow, shuddering breath and whispered, "That's the key. It's the one they used to lock me in." Paul's stomach churned. He had no idea who had done this to her, or why, but there was no time to dwell on it now. The key had saved her. The key had unlocked the chain. Max had led them to it, and in a moment of desperate hope, everything had come together. With a sigh of relief, Paul looked at the girl. "We're going to get you home," he promised, his voice thick with emotion, and this time he believed it. Max, sitting proudly by his side, gave a soft bark as if a greeting. The flames from the burning car crackled and hissed behind them, the heat radiating even through the thick canopy of trees. Paul couldn't stop shaking as he held the girl close, his mind racing. He had pulled her out of the car, he had saved her from the fire, but now they were stranded in the woods. The closest road was at least a mile away, and with the fire spreading so quickly, he knew they couldn't risk going back toward the wreck. "Hang in there," Paul muttered, looking down at the girl. She was still clinging to his side, her small body trembling uncontrollably, but at least she wasn't crying anymore. She had stopped speaking, but he could see her lips moving as if she were praying under her breath. Max, ever the protector, had not left their side. The dog's ears were perked, eyes alert, as he stood at the front, leading the way through the underbrush. Paul marveled at the dog's calmness. Max seemed to know exactly where to go. But the situation was getting worse. Paul glanced back over his shoulder. The fire's crackling grew louder, the smoke thicker, swallowing up the sky. It wouldn't be long before the fire spread through the woods, consuming everything in its path. There was no time to waste. They had to move faster. "Max," Paul said, his voice hoarse, "find us a way out." Max barked in response, his tail wagging slightly, and trotted ahead, stopping every few yards to check if they were following. The dog's instincts were spot on. Every time Paul thought they had reached a dead end or thick brush, Max would lead them around it, pushing forward with quiet determination. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the woods and finally saw it. Up ahead, the outline of a small dirt road. Relief flooded through Paul's chest, but just as quickly, it was replaced by a sense of urgency. They weren't out of the woods yet. The fire was still spreading rapidly, and there was no guarantee that they could make it to safety before the flames reached them. Max paused again, this time standing still and watching Paul, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Paul didn't need to be told twice. He set off toward the road, his legs burning with fatigue, but driven by the need to get the girl out of danger. Behind him, the fire raged, but in front of him, there was hope. They were close now, closer than they'd ever been. The road ahead stretched out before them, a narrow dirt path leading toward the distant sounds of sirens and rescue. Max had led them this far, never faltering, always pushing ahead with purpose. His steady pace gave Paul hope, even as the smoke billowed behind them, thick and choking. The fire was still roaring, but now it was a distant memory, something they had outrun. For the first time since the crash, Paul allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He glanced down at the girl, still huddled against his side, her eyes wide, but no longer filled with terror. She was exhausted, her tiny body still trembling, but she hadn't made a sound since they had left the car. Paul could tell she was in shock, but at least she was safe. "We're almost there," Paul said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "Just a little further." Max barked, as if to confirm Paul's words, and then trotted ahead, tail held high, his head scanning the path for any sign of danger. Paul followed, his gaze never leaving the dog. Max had been more than just a companion through this nightmare. He had been their guide, their protector, and their savior. As they neared the road, the first of the fire trucks appeared in the distance, their flashing lights cutting through the haze of smoke. The sound of the sirens grew louder, closer, and Paul's heart lifted. They had made it. When they finally reached the edge of the road, Max stopped and looked back at Paul, his eyes glowing with a mix of pride and determination. Paul crouched down and gave him a quick scratch behind the ears. "You did it, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her. You saved both of us." The girl, still holding onto Paul's arm, looked up at Max with wide eyes. She'd been silent through most of the ordeal, but now she whispered, "He's a hero, isn't he?" Paul nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, he is." By the time the first firefighter arrived, Max was already sitting proudly beside Paul and the girl, his tail wagging slowly as though he knew the magnitude of his actions. The firefighter dropped to one knee, placing a hand on Max's head. "You're a good boy," he said, his voice filled with awe. "A real hero." The crowd that had gathered around them began to murmur, many of them snapping pictures and filming on their phones. But for Paul, it was clear, the real hero in this story was not the firefighters, not the emergency responders, but the dog who had refused to give up. Max had led them to safety. He had found the key, and he had given them both a second chance at life. The fire was quickly under control, the trucks dousing the remaining flames as the smell of smoke lingered in the air. Paul stood on the side of the road, the girl now wrapped in a blanket, a medic by her side offering water. Her face was pale, her clothes singed, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Her eyes, though tired, held a glimmer of gratitude, a silent thank you that Paul could feel deep in his chest. Max sat beside them, his tongue lolling out in contentment, as if he had done nothing more than his daily job. He had rescued them both, and now, with the danger past, he was simply happy to be with his family again. The bond between them, forged through years of companionship, had never been clearer. Max had always been more than a pet to Paul. He was a partner, a best friend. But today, he had been something more. A true hero. Paul rubbed Max's head gently, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us, buddy. I don't even know how you knew what to do, but you did it. You're something else." Max barked softly, tail wagging, as if he understood every word. The dog had always been intuitive, but today he had defied all expectations. He had led Paul and the girl to safety, finding the key, guiding them out of danger, and never once leaving their side. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, a force of nature in his own right. The girl, who had been silent for so long, now looked up at Paul. "Who does he?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "He's incredible." Paul smiled softly, the weight of everything they had just survived pressing down on him. "This is Max," he said, his voice filled with pride. "He's my dog, my best friend. And today, he was our hero." A paramedic came over to check on the girl, but Paul could see that she was already recovering, no longer the frightened, trembling child he had found in the backseat of that wrecked car. She was safe, she was going to be okay, and most of that was because of Max. As the paramedics prepared to take the girl to the hospital for further evaluation, she turned to Paul and gave him a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "And thank you to Max. for saving me." Paul nodded, his heart swelling with pride. The girl was going to be all right, and Max, his hero, had made sure of that.